In a remote Italian villa, a 68-year-old widow was about to discover the depths of family betrayal. What started as a peaceful morning coffee took a shocking turn when she came face to face with abandonment. Zenaida Matthews wasn't your typical retired grandmother. For 35 years, she had mastered languages and navigated foreign cultures, known for her razor-sharp intellect hidden beneath confusion. When she encountered her son's note explaining his abandonment, she had no idea she was walking into the fight of her life. Zenaida's response, dropping her helpless act, would lead to an international reckoning. What began as calculated disposal would become a masterclass in underestimation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted golden streaks across the terracotta tiles of the villa's terrace, and Zenaida Matthews let herself savor the warmth against her face. The espresso in her delicate porcelain cup had gone cold 20 minutes ago, but she held it anyway, watching the mist rise from the valley below. Tuscany in early September was everything the travel brochures promised. Rolling hills dotted with cypress trees, the air sweet with the last of summer's lavender. "Mom, where did you put the charger for your phone?" David's voice carried that familiar edge of impatience as he emerged from the villa, wheeling her larger suitcase behind him. Zenaida blinked slowly, letting confusion cloud her features, a performance she'd perfected over the past 18 months. "Charger? Which one, dear?" "The phone charger." "For your mobile." David set the suitcase down with more force than necessary, the sound sharp against the morning quiet. "We've been through this." She gestured vaguely toward the villa. "Kitchen counter? Or, perhaps?" She let her voice trail off, tilting her head as if trying to grasp an elusive memory. It wasn't entirely an act. Sometimes the thoughts really did slip away like minnows in a stream, but not as often as she let him believe. David's jaw tightened. At 42, he'd inherited his father's weak chin and her own stubborn streak, though he'd weaponized both in ways she'd never imagined. "Never mind. I'll look for it." The truth was, Zenaida knew exactly where everything was. The charger sat in her handbag, coiled neatly beside the small Italian phrasebook she'd brought, the same one she'd used during that glorious summer of 1974 when she'd taught English to Italian students in Rome. Before marriage, before David, before Harold's betrayals had reshaped her understanding of trust. She watched David fuss with the rental car keys, checking his watch for the third time in 5 minutes. Something brittle lived in his movements today, a tension she recognized from his teenage years, when he'd been caught in lies about money or grades. "Are we leaving for Siena soon?" she asked, though she noticed he'd loaded both suitcases into the car, including her large one, which seemed odd for a day trip. "Actually, Mum, there's been a change of plans." David's tone carried forced brightness, like sunlight through dirty glass. "I need to run into Florence. Quick meeting with a potential client. You remember how important work is right now." Zenaida nodded obediently, though she'd stopped believing in David's mysterious business opportunities months ago. His architectural firm had collapsed 2 years prior, taking his marriage and most of his credibility with it. The consultancy work he claimed to be doing seemed to exist primarily in conversations with her. "You'll be much more comfortable here," he continued, not quite meeting her eyes. "The villa owner, Signora Bertoli. She's lovely, speaks a bit of English. You can rest, enjoy the garden. I'll be back tomorrow evening." Tomorrow evening. Something cold moved through Zenaida's chest, though she kept her expression placid. This morning he'd mentioned a day trip to Siena. Now it was overnight in Florence. The mathematics of deception had never been David's strong suit. "Will you be all right driving alone, dear?" she asked, testing. "Of course." His relief at her acquiescence was palpable. "You know I prefer driving solo for business trips. Fewer distractions." He kissed her forehead, a gesture that once meant tenderness but now felt like absolution for something she didn't yet understand. The rental car's engine turned over smoothly, and David raised his hand in a casual wave. "Take care of yourself, Mum." "Rest well." The car disappeared down the winding drive, leaving only the sound of cicadas and the distant bleating of goats. Zenaida remained on the terrace, her cold espresso forgotten, as the morning stretched into afternoon. At 3 o'clock, Signora Bertoli appeared, a weathered woman in her 70s, with kind eyes and calloused hands. Her English was indeed limited, but her meaning was clear enough. Signora Matthews, your son, he pay only one night. Tonight you must. She made a gentle shooing gesture, then looked genuinely distressed. I am sorry. He say you understand. One night. Zenaida felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. Like the moment in earthquake when you realize the ground beneath your feet isn't as solid as you'd believed. Did he leave a message? Una messaggio? Signora Bertoli nodded and produced a folded paper from her apron pocket. Zenaida recognized David's hurried scrawl immediately. Mum, I know this seems sudden, but you'll be better off here. The pace suits you, and the stress of London isn't good for your condition. Signora B will help you find somewhere more permanent. The money I left should cover basics until you get settled. This is for the best. D, the money he left. Zenaida checked her handbag with trembling fingers. Her wallet held exactly 37 euros and some loose change. Enough for perhaps 2 meals. Certainly not enough for settling somewhere permanent or getting home to London. For a moment the earth seemed to tilt. David had abandoned her. Her only child had driven away from this remote Italian villa, with her passport, her credit cards, her return ticket, and apparently every intention of never seeing her again. But as the initial shock faded, something else rose in its place. Something Zenaida hadn't felt in the 3 years since Harold's death. Something sharp and bright, and entirely focused. She walked back to the terrace and sat down heavily in the wrought iron chair, but her mind was moving faster than it had in months. David thought she was becoming helpless, confused, dependent. He believed his performance of the dutiful but overwhelmed son and her performance of the declining mother were both entirely authentic. He'd made the first critical error that all successful manipulators eventually make. He'd started believing his own lies. Zenaida opened the Italian phrase book to the first page and began to read. Her pronunciation was rusty after 50 years, but the words came back like muscle memory. She'd taught languages for 35 years. French, Spanish, and yes, Italian. She'd navigated foreign countries alone, managed classroom discipline with teenagers, balanced budgets and lesson plans, and parent conferences. She'd also discovered and survived Harold's 17-year affair with his secretary, managed their finances through his early retirement, and dealt with his manipulative guilt and blame when she'd finally confronted him about the betrayal. David had inherited his father's talent for underestimating her. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant lower when Zenaida made her first real decision. She would not be better off here because David had decided so. She would not disappear quietly into some Italian old-age home because her son found her inconvenient. She would find her way home. And when she did, David would discover that the confused, helpless mother he'd abandoned was neither of those things. But first, she needed allies. And that meant walking down to the village to introduce herself properly, not as the bewildered English tourist her son had described to Signora Bertoli, but as Zenaida Matthews, former language teacher, widow, and survivor. She stood up from the terrace chair, her spine straighter than it had been in months. The late afternoon light caught the determined set of her jaw as she looked down the valley toward the red-tiled roofs of the village below. Time to remind everyone, especially herself, exactly who she really was. The late afternoon light cast long shadows across the cobblestone path as Zenaida made her way down from the villa toward the village. Each step felt deliberate, purposeful, so different from the shuffling uncertainty she'd performed for David's benefit these past months. Her handbag contained the Italian phrasebook, 37 euros, and a determination that surprised her with its intensity. The village of San Michele appeared gradually through the olive groves, a cluster of honey-colored stone buildings crowned by a modest church bell tower. Children's voices echoed from a small piazza where mothers gathered while their offspring chased a football between ancient fountain stones. The scene was achingly peaceful, the kind of Italian postcard moment that tourists paid thousands to experience. Zenaida paused at the village's edge, suddenly aware of how she must appear. A silver-haired Englishwoman in sensible walking shoes, clutching a handbag like a lifeline. The mothers in the piazza glanced her way with polite curiosity, but she could read the questions in their expressions. Lost tourist? Confused elderly woman? Someone to be helped with gentle condescension? Not today. She straightened her shoulders and approached the nearest woman, a kind-faced mother in her 40s, bouncing a toddler on her hip. Scusi, signora, Zenaida began, her Italian rusty but determined. Dove la chiesa? The woman's face brightened at the attempt at her language. La chiesa di San Michele? La, she pointed toward the bell tower. Padre Giuseppe, lui parla un po' inglese. Father Giuseppe, a priest who spoke some English. Zenaida nodded her thanks and followed the woman's directions through narrow streets that seemed unchanged since medieval times. The church of San Michele sat at the village's heart, its weathered stone facade bearing the gentle scars of centuries. The heavy wooden door yielded to her touch with a satisfying creak. Inside, the air was cool and scented with beeswax and incense. Afternoon light filtered through stained glass windows, painting rainbow patterns on worn stone floors. A handful of elderly parishioners sat scattered among the pews, some praying, others simply resting in the sacred quiet. Posso aiutarla? The voice came from behind her, warm, concerned, carrying the careful English of someone who'd learned the language as an adult. Zenaida turned to find a man in his mid-50s, wearing a simple black cassock. His face was weathered but kind, with intelligent dark eyes that seemed to see more than they revealed. Father Giuseppe? When he nodded, she felt something inside her chest ease slightly. I'm Zenaida Matthews. I find myself in rather difficult circumstances. Father Giuseppe studied her for a moment, and she had the distinct impression he was taking her measure in a way that had nothing to do with her age or apparent vulnerability. English, yes? Please, sit. He gestured toward a pew near a side altar dedicated to St. Christopher. You are staying at Villa Bertoli? Was staying, Zenaida corrected, settling onto the worn wooden bench. My son. He brought me here yesterday for what I believed was a brief vacation. This morning he left for Florence and hasn't returned. Signora Bertoli says he paid for only one night. Giuseppe's expression darkened slightly. He'd clearly encountered family complications before. And your son, he will return tomorrow? Zenaida withdrew David's note from her handbag and handed it to the priest. Giuseppe read it slowly, his frown deepening with each line. This is very troubling, Signora. Your son, he leaves you here with no way to return to England? No passport, no credit cards, no return ticket. Just this. She showed him the meager contents of her wallet. Giuseppe was quiet for a long moment, his fingers steepled in thought. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted. Less pastoral comfort, more practical assessment. Signora Matthews, forgive my directness, but I must ask. Your son, he believes you cannot care for yourself? There is some difficulty with your health? Here was the moment of truth. Zenaida could continue the performance of confusion and helplessness, could play the role of the declining mother that David expected, or she could trust this stranger with the truth. She met Giuseppe's steady gaze. I've been allowing him to believe my memory issues are worse than they are. After my husband died 3 years ago, I retreated into myself. It was easier to seem confused than to deal with David's constant worry about my finances, my living situation, his belief that I needed managing. Giuseppe nodded slowly. And now this management has become abandonment. Precisely. The word came out sharper than she'd intended. But father, I should tell you, I'm not the helpless woman my son described to Signora Bertoli. I taught languages for 35 years. I spent a summer in Rome in 1974 teaching English. My Italian is rusty, but it's returning. As if to prove her point, she continued in careful but correct Italian. Non sono una donna confusa che ha bisogno di protezione. Sono una donna che è stata tradita da suo figlio. I am not a confused woman who needs protection. I am a woman who has been betrayed by her son. Giuseppe's eyebrows rose slightly. Your Italian is indeed returning, Signora. And I think perhaps your strength is as well. Quote, I hope so, father. Because I need to find a way home to London, and I need to understand why my son believed he could simply Discard me. Giuseppe was quiet for several minutes, studying the note again. When he looked up, there was something new in his expression. A sharpness that suggested the priest hadn't always worn robes. Signora Matthews, before I took holy orders 15 years ago, I practiced law in Milano. I have some experience with complicated family situations. What your son has done, abandoning you without resources in a foreign country, this raises serious legal questions. Legal questions. The phrase sent a thrill through Zenaida that she hadn't expected. You mean what he's done might be criminal? Possibly, but first we must address your immediate needs. The church has guest quarters. Simple but clean. You are welcome to stay while we determine how to help you. Relief flooded through her so suddenly that tears pricked her eyes. When was the last time someone had offered help without expecting her to play the role of grateful, dependent recipient? Father Giuseppe, thank you. But I should tell you, I have very little money. He waved dismissively. The church provides sanctuary to those who need it. That is what we are for. He paused, studying her again. Tomorrow I will introduce you to Elena Rossi. She owns the village cafe and speaks excellent English. She spent several years in London and understands both systems. Together, we will help you find your way home. As Giuseppe led her through the church toward the modest guest quarters, Zenaida felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The profound relief of being seen for who she really was, not who others expected her to be. The guest room was small but spotless, with a narrow bed, a wooden desk, and a window that looked out over the village rooftops toward the darkening hills. As Giuseppe left her to settle in, promising to bring her something to eat shortly, Zenaida sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself a moment of quiet assessment. 12 hours ago, she'd been playing the role of David's gradually declining mother. Now she was an abandoned woman in a foreign country with a former lawyer turned priest as an ally and the beginning of a plan. David had made his first critical miscalculation when he'd underestimated her capabilities. But as Zenaida opened her phrasebook and began refreshing her memory of Italian verb conjugations, she suspected it wouldn't be his last. The village church bells chimed 8 o'clock as she settled in for her first night of real rest in months, her mind already working on the problem of getting home and making her son face the consequences of his betrayal. The scent of fresh espresso and warm cornetti drifted through Zenaida's window as dawn broke over San Michele. She'd slept better than she had in months, the kind of deep, dreamless rest that comes when the mind finally stops pretending to be something it isn't. The church bells had chimed 6 o'clock when she'd awakened, feeling more alert and purposeful than she had since Harold's funeral. Father Giuseppe knocked softly at 7:30, carrying a simple breakfast of bread, jam, and coffee on a wooden tray. Buongiorno, Signora Matthews. You slept well? Better than I have in years, Father. Thank you. She accepted the tray gratefully, noting how he watched her movements, not with pity or concern, but with the assessment of someone gauging an ally's capabilities. Elena opens her cafe at 8. She will be expecting us. Giuseppe paused in the doorway. I spoke with her last evening. She is very interested in your situation. An hour later, Zenaida found herself walking through the village piazza beside Giuseppe, her step lighter than it had been yesterday. The morning bustle was gentle but purposeful, shopkeepers opening their doors, children walking to school with bright backpacks, elderly men gathering around the fountain for their daily discourse on politics and weather. Cafe Rossi occupied the ground floor of a 3-story building on the piazza's eastern side. Through the large windows, Zenaida could see warm yellow walls lined with photographs of London, Big Ben, Tower Bridge, the Thames at sunset. A woman in her mid-30s moved behind the counter with practiced efficiency, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her movements suggesting someone comfortable in her own space. The bell above the door chimed their entrance, and the woman looked up with a smile that faltered slightly when she saw Giuseppe's serious expression. Elena, Giuseppe said in Italian. This is Signora Zenaida Matthews, the English lady I mentioned. Elena emerged from behind the counter, wiping her hands on her apron. When she spoke, her English carried only the faintest trace of an Italian accent. Mrs. Matthews, Giuseppe told me about your Situation. Please, sit. Let me get you proper coffee. Not that instant rubbish the English drink. Despite everything, Zenaida found herself smiling. I'd be grateful for proper coffee. And please, call me Zenaida. Elena bustled about, preparing 3 perfect cappuccinos, while Giuseppe guided Zenaida to a table near the window. The cafe was empty except for them. The morning rush wouldn't begin for another hour. When Elena joined them, her expression had shifted to something Zenaida recognized immediately. The look of a woman who'd faced her own battles, and had little patience for those who preyed on the vulnerable. So, Elena said without preamble, your son abandoned you here, thinking you're too confused to find your way home. That's an accurate summary, yes. Elena's jaw tightened. Men who underestimate women usually learn the hard way that it's a mistake. Tell me exactly what happened. Over the next 30 minutes, Zenaida recounted the previous day's events, showing Elena the note David had left. As she spoke, she watched Elena's expression darken with each detail. 37 euros, Elena muttered when Zenaida finished. Madonna mia, what kind of son does this? The kind who's been slowly stealing from his mother's accounts, Giuseppe said quietly. I reviewed the note again this morning. This reference to money he left for basics. It suggests he's been managing her finances. Elena leaned forward. Zenaida, forgive me for asking, but do you have access to your bank accounts? Online banking? I do, though I've been letting David handle most of the details lately. The admission tasted bitter. Another part of my performance. Performance? Elena's eyebrows rose. Zenaida found herself explaining again about the exaggerated confusion, the retreat into helplessness after Harold's death. Elena listened without judgment, nodding occasionally. I understand, Elena said finally. After my divorce 5 years ago, I let everyone believe I was too fragile to manage alone. It seemed easier than fighting. Then I woke up one day and realized I'd become the weak woman they expected me to be. What changed? Elena's smile held an edge. My ex-husband tried to claim half the cafe, the one I'd bought with my own money while he was gambling away our savings in London casinos. That's when I learned that sometimes you have to fight dirty to protect what's yours. Giuseppe cleared his throat. Elena has experience with creative problem solving. She also maintains connections in London from her years there. 5 years managing a restaurant in Camden, Elena confirmed. I know how both systems work. Italian and British. Banking, legal procedures, travel requirements. She paused. Giuseppe says you used to teach languages? 35 years. French, Spanish, and Italian. I spent the summer of 1974 in Rome. Elena's expression brightened. Then you understand how things work here. Not just the language, the culture. How to read people, how to navigate bureaucracy. I'm beginning to remember, yes. Good. Elena stood abruptly. Because we're gonna need all of that to get you home and make your son face what he's done. Giuseppe looked between the two women and smiled slightly. I sense the formation of an alliance. More than that, Elena said, her tone sharp with purpose. We're going to teach David Matthews that abandoning his mother was the worst miscalculation of his life. She turned back to Zenaida. But first, we need information. Real information about your finances, your son's situation, his real reasons for doing this. Elena disappeared behind the counter and returned with a laptop. My nephew Marco lives upstairs. He's a computer programmer, works remotely. He can help us access your accounts safely, trace what your son has been doing. As if summoned, footsteps thundered down the interior staircase, and a young man in his late 20s appeared, rubbing sleep from his eyes. His English, when Elena introduced him, was flawless. Marco Benedetti, Uncle Giuseppe told me about your situation, Signora. I'm sorry this happened to you, but... He grinned, suddenly looking much younger. I have to admit, I'm impressed that you're fighting back. Elena clapped her hands together. Perfect. Marco, we need to examine Zenaida's banking records. Carefully and legally, of course. Of course, Marco agreed, though his grin suggested he was comfortable operating in gray areas when the cause was just. Giuseppe looked around the table at the three faces. Elena's fierce determination, Marco's eager helpfulness, and Zenaida's growing confidence. "I believe," he said slowly, "that David Matthews has made a very serious error in judgment." Zenaida felt something warm and powerful unfurling in her chest. For the first time in 3 years, she wasn't facing a crisis alone. These people, strangers yesterday, were willing to fight beside her not because she was helpless, but because what had been done to her was wrong. "So," she said, meeting each of their gazes in turn, "where do we begin?" Elena's smile was sharp as a blade. "We begin by finding out exactly what your son has been up to in London. And then we make sure he understands that abandoning his mother was only the beginning of his problems." As Marco opened his laptop and Giuseppe pulled out a notepad with the methodical movements of someone preparing for legal battle, Zenaida realized that David's miscalculation ran deeper than he could possibly imagine. He hadn't just underestimated her capabilities, he'd underestimated the power of people united by a shared sense of justice. The morning sun climbed higher over San Michele as 4 unlikely conspirators began planning their campaign. Marco's fingers moved across the keyboard with the fluid precision of someone who thought in code rather than words. The café's morning rush had begun, but Elena had claimed the back corner table as their command center, bringing them fresh coffee and pastries while intercepting curious glances from regular customers with practiced ease. "Right," Marco said, adjusting the laptop screen so Zenaida could see it clearly. "Let's start with your online banking. Do you remember your login details?" Zenaida nodded, though she felt a flutter of anxiety as she began typing. For months, she deliberately avoided looking too closely at her accounts, part of her performance of declining capability. Now, as the familiar bank homepage loaded, she wondered what David's management had actually entailed. "Username and password," Marco prompted gently, then turned the screen toward her for privacy. Her fingers remembered the keystrokes automatically, the same login she'd used for 15 years, despite David's regular suggestions that she should simplify her online accounts by letting him handle them. The screen flickered, then displayed her account summary. The silence that followed was broken only by the hiss of Elena's espresso machine and the distant chatter of morning customers. "Madonna Santa," Elena whispered, looking over Zenaida's shoulder. Where Zenaida had expected to see the comfortable savings Harold had left her, not wealthy, but sufficient for her remaining years, the numbers told a different story. Her primary savings account showed a balance that made her stomach clench with recognition. This wasn't the gradual decline of someone living on a fixed income. This was systematic depletion. "Marco," Giuseppe's voice carried the careful neutrality of someone containing anger. "Can you help us understand the transaction history?" Marco's fingers flew over the keys, pulling up detailed statements. "Going back how far? 6 months? A year?" 2 years, Zenaida said quietly. "Since Harold's funeral." The screen filled with data, endless rows of transfers, withdrawals, and mysterious charges. But it was Marco who spotted the pattern first. "Look here," he said, pointing to a series of regular transfers. "Every month, sometimes twice a month. Always round numbers. £2,000, £3, 500, £5,000. They're going to," he clicked through several screens. "An account in David Matthews's name." Elena leaned closer. "That's £24,000 in the last 6 months alone." "But that's not all." Marco's expression grew grimmer as he navigated deeper into the records. "There are cash withdrawals too. Always just under the daily limit, spread across different ATMs in London." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Giuseppe pulled out his notepad and began making calculations. If this pattern extends back 2 years, it does. Zenaida's voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she pointed to earlier entries. "I authorized the first few transfers when David said his business was struggling. He needed capital to bid on a major project," he said. "I thought I was helping him get back on his feet." "How much?" Elena asked gently. Zenaida did the mathematics in her head, the skill that had helped her manage household finances for decades while Harold remained blissfully unaware of mundane concerns, like mortgage payments and utility bills. "Based on what I can see here, Approximately 85,000 pounds over 2 years. The number hung in the air like a physical weight. Elena sat back in her chair with an expression that could have curdled milk. "Your son," she said slowly, "has been systematically stealing from you for 2 years, then abandoned you in Italy because he assumed you'd never be capable of discovering what he'd done." "It appears so." Zenaida surprised herself with how calm she sounded. Perhaps the shock was too profound for immediate emotional response. Marco was still clicking through screens. "There's more. These withdrawals here." He pointed to a series of recent transactions. "They're all from the last month. The amounts are getting larger." Giuseppe studied the pattern. "He's accelerating. This suggests desperation." "Or preparation," Elena said darkly. "Maybe he's been planning this abandonment for weeks." Marco minimized the banking windows and opened a new browser tab. "Let me try something else. Social media can tell us a lot about someone's real situation." His fingers moved quickly across the keyboard. "David Matthews, London, architect." Here we are. David's LinkedIn profile appeared on screen. A professional headshot that was at least 5 years old, showing him in an expensive suit that Zenaida remembered buying him for a job interview. The profile described him as a, quote, "senior architectural consultant, specializing in luxury residential design." "This is interesting," Marco muttered, scrolling through the profile. "According to this, he's been working steadily for the past 2 years. But look at the details. No specific projects mentioned, no company name, just vague consulting work." Elena peered at the screen. "In my experience, when someone's that vague about their work, it's because there isn't any work." Giuseppe nodded. "The timing aligns with when the large transfers began." Marco switched to Facebook, then Instagram, building a picture of David's life through social media breadcrumbs. What emerged was troubling. Expensive restaurant meals, weekend trips to Brighton, photographs of him at gallery openings and wine tastings that suggested a lifestyle far beyond the means of someone whose architectural firm had collapsed. "He's been living off your money," Elena said bluntly, "not just borrowing it, using it to maintain a lifestyle he can't afford." "But there's something else." Marco had opened a new tab and was typing rapidly. "If he's been stealing this systematically, there might be legal consequences. In the UK, financial elder abuse is taken seriously." Giuseppe leaned forward with interest. "What kind of consequences?" "Criminal charges, potentially. Fraud, theft, financial abuse of a vulnerable person." Marco looked at Zenaida with something approaching admiration. "Though I suspect the vulnerable person classification might not apply to you." Despite everything, Zenaida found herself smiling slightly. "I certainly don't feel vulnerable at the moment. Angry, yes. Betrayed, absolutely. But not vulnerable." Elena stood abruptly. "We need more information." "Marco, can you print out these bank statements? Giuseppe, what do we need legally to document this theft?" "Evidence of unauthorized access, patterns of deception, proof that the transfers were obtained under false pretenses." Giuseppe's legal background was showing clearly now. "But we also need to understand his current situation. Why abandon her now? What's changed?" "I might be able to help with that," Elena said, pulling out her phone. "I still have contacts in London. Restaurant people, service industry, they hear everything." "Give me an hour." As Elena stepped away to make calls, Marco continued printing documents, and Giuseppe made detailed notes. Zenaida sat quietly, processing the magnitude of David's betrayal. The money was significant, but it wasn't the financial loss that cut deepest. It was the calculated nature of it, the way he'd exploited her grief, her retreat into confusion, her desire to help him recover from his failures. "Signora," Marco said gently, "there's something else we should check. Your email accounts. If David has been managing your finances, he might have been intercepting communications from the bank, credit card companies, financial advisors." Zenaida nodded and accessed her email. The inbox told another disturbing story. Dozens of unread messages from her bank, her investment advisor, her insurance company. Messages that David had apparently been deleting before she could see them. He's been controlling information, Giuseppe observed. Classic abusive behavior, isolating the victim from outside sources of support or awareness. Marco recovered the deleted messages, revealing a pattern of concerned communications from financial institutions about unusual account activity, large transfers, changes to contact information. Messages that would have alerted Zenaida to David's activities if she'd been allowed to see them. "The bastard," Elena said, returning from her phone calls with fire in her eyes. "I talked to 3 people who know the London restaurant scene. Your son has been a regular at some very expensive establishments over the past year. Always paying cash, always alone, apparently trying to impress women he'd meet online." Women? Zenaida felt a fresh wave of disgust. Dating apps. Expensive dates, trying to present himself as successful. "One of my contacts saw him just last week at a Mayfair restaurant that charges £200 per person." Elena sat down heavily. "He's been using your money to fund a fantasy life while planning to dispose of you." Giuseppe looked up from his notes. "This gives us motive. He's not just stealing, he's spending recklessly and needed to eliminate the source of oversight." "But he made one crucial mistake," Marco said, closing the laptop with satisfaction. "He assumed you'd never be able to fight back, that you'd just disappear quietly into some Italian care facility." Zenaida felt something cold and determined settling in her chest. The woman who had navigated Harold's affairs, who had managed challenging students and demanding parents, who had learned 3 languages and taught for decades, that woman was fully awake now. "We need to contact someone in London," she said firmly. "Someone who can investigate from that end while we gather evidence here." Elena smiled, and there was something predatory in the expression. "Actually, I might have just the person. My friend Sarah. She's an accountant, very sharp, doesn't like bullies. She owes me a favor from when I helped her through a nasty divorce." "Sarah?" Zenaida felt a flicker of hope. "Not Sarah Matthews?" Elena's eyebrows shot up. "You know her. David's ex-wife. She's an accountant, and she never liked how David handled money." Zenaida felt pieces clicking into place. If anyone would have noticed irregularities in David's finances, it would be Sarah. "Even better," Giuseppe said with satisfaction. "A disgruntled ex-wife with professional accounting skills and access to David's financial history." Marco reopened the laptop. "Should we call her?" Zenaida checked her watch. It was just past noon in Italy, meaning 11 a.m. in London. Sarah would be at work, but she'd always taken personal calls if they were important. "Yes," Zenaida said, feeling the last of her artificial confusion fall away completely. "It's time to let Sarah know that David's mother isn't as helpless as he believed. And it's time to start building a case that will ensure he faces the consequences of his actions." As Elena dialed Sarah's number on her phone, setting it to speaker, Zenaida realized that David's abandonment had accomplished something he never intended. It had forced her to stop hiding behind the performance of decline and remember exactly who she really was. The phone began to ring, and Zenaida prepared to have the most important conversation of her new life. The phone rang 3 times before Sarah's familiar voice answered, crisp, with professional efficiency. "Sarah Matthews speaking." "Sarah, it's Zenaida." The words felt strange. It had been months since she'd initiated contact with anyone from her old life. "I'm calling from Italy." A pause. "Zenaida, I thought you were on holiday with David. Is everything all right? You sound different." Elena exchanged glances with Giuseppe and Marco around the table. Different. Sarah had noticed immediately what David had missed for months, that the confused, declining woman was gone. "I need to tell you something, and I need your help. David didn't bring me on holiday, Sarah. He abandoned me here." The silence that followed was broken only by the sounds of Sarah's London office. Keyboards clicking, phones ringing in the distance. When she spoke again, her voice had shifted into the sharp focus that had made her such a formidable accountant. "Tell me everything." Over the next 20 minutes, with Elena occasionally adding details and Giuseppe providing legal context, Zenaida laid out the full scope of David's betrayal. She could hear Sarah taking notes, her breathing becoming more controlled with each revelation. the way it used to when she was dealing with particularly complex financial irregularities. £85,000, Sarah repeated when Zenaida finished. Over 2 years. And he's been deleting your bank communications? You don't sound surprised, Marco observed. Sarah's laugh was bitter. I've been watching David's spending for the past year, wondering where his money was coming from. He's been living like he has a steady income, but I knew his firm collapsed when he started buying the children expensive gifts and taking them to places we could never afford when we were married. You suspected he was stealing from his mother, Giuseppe said quietly. I suspected something. But David always claimed Zenaida was becoming confused about money, that he was helping her manage her finances. I thought maybe she was giving him an allowance. Sarah's voice turned cold. I never imagined he was systematically robbing her while planning to abandon her in a foreign country. Elena leaned toward the phone. Sarah, this is Elena Rossi. I'm helping Zenaida. We need someone in London who can gather evidence while we work from this end. Are you willing to help? Try to stop me. Sarah's tone could have frozen flames. David has been lying to me about his financial situation while I've been letting him take the children on expensive outings paid for with his mother's stolen money. Yes, I'll help. What do you need? Giuseppe consulted his notes. Legal documentation of his current financial status, evidence of his lifestyle, proof that the money wasn't legitimately earned. Anything that establishes pattern and intent. I can do better than that, Sarah said. David asked me to notarize some financial documents last month. Said they were for a consulting contract. I made copies because something felt off about them. And I've been documenting his spending around the children because I was worried about where the money was coming from. Marco looked impressed. You've been building a case without knowing it. Former accountant, current suspicious ex-wife. It's a powerful combination. Sarah paused. Zenaida, I need to ask, are you really all right? I mean mentally, emotionally. Because David has been telling people that your memory issues are getting worse. Zenaida felt a flash of her old teaching authority. Sarah, I haven't been confused about anything except why I was pretending to be confused. I've been hiding from life since Harold died, letting David manage things because it seemed easier than facing difficult truths. But I'm done hiding. Good. Sarah's voice carried grim satisfaction. Because we're going to need the sharp, decisive woman who used to keep David in line when he was a teenager. She's about to get very busy. Elena pulled out a notepad. We need to coordinate. Sarah, can you document David's current activities without alerting him? Already on it. I'll start with his social media. Screenshot everything before he can delete it. Then I'll check public records for any recent financial filings, business registrations, anything that might show his real situation. Giuseppe added, we also need to establish communication that David can't intercept. If he's been managing Zenaida's email, I'll set up a secure email account, Marco offered. Encrypted, completely separate from anything David might have access to. As Marco's fingers flew over the keyboard, creating secure communication channels, Elena made a list of their other needs. Travel documents, evidence gathering, legal procedures. This is going to be complex. Which brings me to our next step, Zenaida said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her voice. I need to call David? The table went quiet. Giuseppe frowned. Signora, that could be dangerous. If he realizes you're more capable than he believed. He won't realize it, Zenaida said firmly. Because I'm going to give him exactly what he expects to hear. A confused, frightened old woman who's grateful for his help in finding her a nice Italian care facility. Elena's eyes lit up with understanding. You're going to trick him into incriminating himself. I'm going to let him talk. David's weakness has always been his need to justify his actions, especially when he thinks he's talking to someone who can't challenge him. Zenaida looked around the table at her allies. Marco, can you record the call? Easily. And we can set it up so Sarah can hear everything in real time. Sarah's voice came through the speaker with approval. Brilliant. Let David think he's manipulating a helpless woman while we document everything he says. Giuseppe consulted his legal notepad. In Italy, recording calls with one party's consent is legal. In the UK as well. But we need to be strategic about what you say to prompt the most revealing responses. Elena moved to the cafe counter and returned with a pot of fresh coffee. This is going to require performance skills. Can you do it, Zenaida? Can you pretend to be the confused woman he expects? Zenaida sipped her coffee thoughtfully. I've been performing that role for months. The difference is, now I know it's a performance. She looked around the table at the three people who had become her conspirators. What David doesn't understand is that the best actors never forget who they really are underneath the character. Marco finished setting up the recording system and the conference connection with Sarah. Ready when you are. Zenaida took a deep breath and dialed David's number. He answered on the second ring, his voice carrying forced cheerfulness. Mom! How are you settling in? I was just thinking about you. Oh, David, I'm so confused, dear. Zenaida let her voice tremble slightly, adding the vague uncertainty she'd perfected over the past year. I don't understand what's happening. The lady at the villa says you only paid for one night? Did she? Well, there must be some confusion. You know how these language barriers can be, Mom. Giuseppe nodded approvingly. David was already deflecting rather than explaining. But David, I don't have enough money to stay anywhere else, and I don't understand how to get home. I'm frightened, dear. Now, Mom, don't worry about that. I've been making some calls, and I think I found a lovely place for you to stay. Very nice, with English-speaking staff and other British residents. Elena's eyebrows shot up. He was actually trying to place her in an Italian care facility. But I want to come home, David. I miss my garden, my house. Mom, we've talked about this. London isn't suitable for you anymore. The stress, the complexity. It's not good for your condition. You'll be much happier somewhere peaceful, where people can look after you properly. My condition? Zenaida let confusion color her voice while fury burned in her chest. Your memory issues, Mom. They've been getting worse, and it's not safe for you to live alone anymore. This way, you won't have to worry about managing money or making difficult decisions. Marco was typing furiously, documenting every word. Through the speakerphone, they could hear Sarah making her own notes. But what about my house? My savings? Don't worry about any of that. I'll take care of everything. The house can be sold to pay for your care. It's what Dad would have wanted. Giuseppe's pen stopped moving. Sarah's sharp intake of breath was audible through the connection. Sold? Zenaida let her voice rise with manufactured panic. But David, I thought you said I just needed help managing my finances, not that everything would be sold. Well, Mom, your expenses have been quite high lately. The care facility, travel costs, sorting out all your affairs, it adds up quickly. I've been using your savings to handle the immediate costs, but long-term, we'll need to liquidate some assets. Elena shook her head in disgust. He was actually admitting to spending her money while planning to sell her home. How much money have you used, dear? I can't remember what we discussed. Oh, not too much. Just enough to cover essentials. Don't worry about the details, Mom. That's why you have me to handle these things. Marco held up his notepad showing, doesn't want to give specifics. Sign of guilt. David, I'm scared. What if I don't like it at this facility? What if I want to come home? A pause. When David spoke again, his voice had lost some of its artificial warmth. Mom, you need to trust me on this. I know what's best for you now. Your judgment isn't what it used to be, and frankly, living alone in London was becoming dangerous. This is the right decision. But I feel like I'm thinking more clearly today. Maybe the rest has helped. That's just a good day, Mom. Tomorrow you might not remember this conversation. That's why I need to make these decisions for you. Giuseppe was writing rapidly, gaslighting, undermining her perception of reality. Zenaida took a breath and played her final card. David, I found some papers in my handbag, bank statements. I don't understand them, but there seemed to be transfers to your account. Did you need to borrow money? The silence stretched long enough for Elena to look concerned. When David finally spoke, his voice was tight. Those are just temporary arrangements, Mom. I've been advancing money for your expenses and then reimbursing myself from your accounts. It's much simpler that way. Avoids confusion. How much money, David? It's complicated, Mom. Different amounts for different things. Don't worry about it. But the statements show thousands of pounds. Mom, this is exactly why you need professional care. You're getting agitated over financial details that are perfectly normal. I'm handling everything properly. Sarah's voice came through clearly. He's panicking. Zenaida decided to push further. David, I tried to call you yesterday, but your phone went straight to voicemail. Where were you? Another pause. I was busy with meetings. Setting up your care arrangements takes time. What kind of meetings? Business meetings, Mum. You wouldn't understand. Giuseppe nodded. David was becoming defensive, less careful with his words. I'm worried about you, dear. You sound stressed. I'm fine, Mom. Just trying to sort out a complicated situation. His voice cracked slightly. Look, I need to go. I'll call you tomorrow with details about the care facility. David, wait! The line went dead. Marco stopped the recording and leaned back in his chair. Well, that was illuminating. Sarah's voice came through the speaker, sharp with anger. Did you hear him? He's planning to sell her house to pay for the care facility he's forcing her into, after stealing £85,000 of her savings. Elena looked at Zenaida with admiration. You were brilliant. You got him to admit to everything. The theft, the plans for institutionalization, even that he's been making major financial decisions without your real consent. Giuseppe was reviewing his notes. This recording, combined with the banking evidence and Sarah's documentation, gives us a strong case for financial elder abuse. But we're not done yet, Zenaida said, feeling a cold satisfaction settle in her chest. David thinks he's handled a confused old woman who stumbled onto some confusing paperwork. He has no idea what's really happening. Marco saved the recording to multiple locations. What's our next move? Zenaida looked around the table at her unlikely team of allies. We're going to let David believe he's won while we build an airtight case against him. And then, when I walk through his door in London next week, he's going to discover that the helpless mother he abandoned was the worst miscalculation of his life. Elena raised her coffee cup in a toast to teaching David Matthews that some mothers bite back. As they clinked cups around the table, Zenaida realized that David's betrayal had accomplished something he never intended. It had forced her to remember that she'd always been a fighter. She'd just forgotten for a while. Now it was time to remind everyone else. 4 days later, Zenaida stood in the Florence Airport departure lounge, her reflection in the terminal window showing a woman transformed. Gone was the tentative posture and uncertain gaze of the confused widow David had abandoned. In their place stood someone who moved with purpose, her silver hair neatly styled, her clothes chosen for professional meetings rather than hiding behind a facade of decline. Elena had driven her to Florence that morning, the car filled with careful preparations rather than fond farewells. They both knew this wasn't goodbye. It was the beginning of phase 2. Remember, Elena had said as they parked outside the terminal, David expects broken communication from a confused woman in an Italian care facility. The last thing he's anticipating is you walking into a London police station with legal representation. The legal representation was Giuseppe's doing. His former colleagues in Milan had connections with international law firms, and a brief conversation about financial elder abuse had yielded the contact information for Victoria Hamilton, a solicitor specializing in exactly these cases. Victoria would be meeting Zenaida at Heathrow, another detail David couldn't possibly anticipate. Marco had spent the past 3 days creating what he cheerfully called digital armor, secure communication systems, encrypted file storage, and a comprehensive dossier of evidence that would be impossible for David to delete or intercept. The recording of their phone conversation had been transcribed, analyzed, and cross-referenced with the banking evidence until their case resembled a forensic accountant's masterpiece. Sarah's work from London had been equally thorough. Her accountant's instincts and ex-wife's suspicions had combined to create a devastating portrait of David's activities. Social media screenshots showing expensive meals and luxury purchases, financial records she'd copied during their marriage, even testimonies from mutual friends who'd questioned David's mysterious income sources. But it was the children's testimony that had sealed Sarah's commitment to the case. 8-year-old Emma and 10-year-old Thomas had innocently described their father's expensive gifts, the sudden upgrades to restaurants and entertainment, the way he'd started bragging about his successful consulting work, right around the time his grandmother seemed to become more confused and dependent. "Children notice everything," Sarah had told Zenaida during their final planning call. "They just don't understand what they're seeing until an adult helps them connect the dots." Now, as Zenaida's flight began boarding, she felt the calm focus that had carried her through decades of managing difficult students and parents. This was simply another challenging situation that required careful preparation and strategic execution. The flight to London passed in careful review of her plans. Victoria Hamilton would meet her at customs, then drive her directly to Sarah's flat for final coordination before approaching the authorities. Detective Inspector Collins of the Metropolitan Police Economic Crime Unit had been briefed by Victoria and was expecting them the following morning, though he'd been told only that it involved financial elder abuse, not that the alleged victim was far more formidable than typical cases. Giuseppe had coached her on this point during their final conversation. Let Detective Collins form his own impressions based on his preconceptions, the priest-turned-legal advisor had suggested. Men like that often reveal their biases early. Let him underestimate you initially. It will make the revelation of your actual capabilities more powerful. Heathrow's customs hall was exactly as Zenaida remembered from her departure 4 days earlier. Efficient, anonymous, designed for processing rather than personal connection. But this time, she wasn't David's confused mother being shepherded through travel procedures. She was a woman with purpose, legal representation, and a comprehensive plan for justice. Victoria Hamilton was immediately recognizable from Elena's description: early 40s, professionally dressed, with the kind of sharp intelligence that made itself known in the first handshake. She greeted Zenaida with a warm smile that didn't quite hide her assessment of her new client. "Mrs. Matthews, I'm Victoria Hamilton. I hope your flight was comfortable." "Please call me Zenaida, and yes, very comfortable, thank you. Though I suspect the next few days will be anything but." Victoria's smile became genuine. "I like clients who understand what they're walking into. Sarah is waiting for us. She's quite eager to meet the woman who managed to orchestrate her own rescue from international abandonment." The drive through London's afternoon traffic gave Victoria time to outline the legal landscape. Financial elder abuse cases are taken very seriously here, particularly when they involve international elements. Your son's decision to abandon you in Italy adds several potential charges. False imprisonment, potentially kidnapping if we can prove premeditation. Can we prove premeditation? Zenaida asked, watching familiar London neighborhoods scroll past the car window. Marco's evidence suggests yes. The booking records showed David paid for only 1 night at the villa, but told you it was a week-long holiday. The timing of the large cash withdrawals suggests he was preparing for your absence, and that recorded phone call. Victoria's professional composure cracked slightly. "I've been practicing law for 15 years. And I've rarely heard such clear evidence of gaslighting and financial manipulation." They arrived at Sarah's flat in Hampstead, just as the autumn sun was beginning to set. Sarah answered the door immediately, as if she'd been watching for their arrival, and Zenaida found herself face-to-face with her former daughter-in-law for the first time in nearly a year. Sarah had always been attractive in a sharp, professional way, but now she looked like someone who'd found a cause worth fighting for. Her embrace was fierce and brief. "Zenaida, God, you look different, stronger." "I feel stronger. Thank you for everything you've done, Sarah. I know this can't be easy." Sarah's laugh held no humor. "Easy? David has been using your stolen money to take my children to restaurants I can't afford, while telling them their grandmother is becoming too confused to care for herself. Easy doesn't factor into this." Victoria set her briefcase on Sarah's dining table and began spreading out documents with practiced efficiency. "Right. Let's review what we have before tomorrow's meeting with Detective Inspector Collins. The next hour was spent in meticulous preparation. Victoria walked them through each piece of evidence, explaining how it would be presented, what questions to expect, how to handle Collins's likely skepticism about elderly victims who seemed too competent. The key, Victoria explained, is letting Collins discover your capabilities naturally rather than defending them. Answer his questions directly. Provide details he doesn't expect. Show, rather than tell him, that you're not the confused victim he's anticipating. Sarah added her perspective from their phone conversations with Elena and Marco. The Italian evidence is crucial because it shows premeditation and international scope. David didn't just steal from you, he planned to disappear you entirely. As evening settled over London, Zenaida found herself looking out Sarah's window toward the lights of the city she'd called home for over 40 years. Tomorrow, she would walk into a police station and formally accuse her only child of systematic theft and abandonment. The woman who had pretended to be confused for nearly 2 years was about to demonstrate exactly how sharp and determined she really was. "Are you ready for this?" Victoria asked, following her gaze toward the window. Zenaida thought about Giuseppe's quiet strength, Elena's fierce loyalty, Marco's patient technical skills. She thought about the kindness of strangers who had become true allies, contrasted against the calculated cruelty of her own son. "Victoria, 4 days ago I was a woman pretending to be helpless because it seemed easier than fighting. Tonight, I'm a woman with legal representation, comprehensive evidence, and international allies who believe in justice." She turned from the window with a slight smile. David has spent 2 years stealing from someone he thought was too confused to fight back. Tomorrow he's going to discover that was the worst miscalculation of his life. Sarah raised her wine glass in a toast. To Detective Inspector Collins getting the surprise of his career, Victoria joined the toast with her coffee mug. To justice served by the least likely avengers. As they clinked glasses in Sarah's cozy flat, Zenaida felt the profound satisfaction of a plan perfectly executed. David believed his problematic mother was safely contained in an Italian care facility, spending her remaining days in medicated confusion while he liquidated her assets. Instead, she was in London with legal counsel, comprehensive evidence, and allies who had helped her remember exactly who she'd always been underneath the performance of decline. Tomorrow, Detective Inspector Collins would meet the real Zenaida Matthews. And David would begin to understand that abandoning his mother hadn't eliminated his problems. It had created far worse ones. The transformation was complete. The fight was about to begin. Detective Inspector Collins's expression shifted from polite skepticism to focused attention sometime between the banking records and the recorded phone call. By the time Victoria finished presenting the evidence, he was leaning forward across his desk with the intensity of someone who recognized a career-defining case. "Mrs. Matthews?" Collins said, his tone markedly different from the patronizing courtesy he'd begun with. "I need to ask you directly. Are you certain you want to proceed with criminal charges against your son?" Zenaida met his gaze steadily. "Detective Inspector, my son stole £85,000 from my accounts over 2 years, then abandoned me in a foreign country with no resources, believing I was too confused to ever challenge him." "Yes, I'm certain." Collins nodded slowly. "The evidence you've presented is comprehensive. Financial elder abuse, false imprisonment, potentially fraud and theft. We'll need to execute a search warrant and arrest him before he has time to destroy additional evidence or flee." "When?" Sarah asked. "This afternoon. I'll coordinate with the Financial Crimes Unit to freeze his accounts immediately." Collins looked at Zenaida with something approaching admiration. "Ma'am, I've been handling these cases for 12 years, and I've never seen a victim return with this level of evidence and preparation." Victoria gathered her documents with satisfaction. "What about the arrest itself?" "We'll take him at his flat. Based on his recent activities, he shouldn't be expecting any difficulties." Collins paused. "Mrs. Matthews, you don't need to be present for the arrest, but I want to be there," Zenaida finished. "I want David to see exactly who he abandoned in Italy." 3 hours later, Zenaida stood on the pavement outside David's Islington flat, flanked by Victoria and Sarah, watching as two unmarked police cars positioned themselves strategically. Detective Inspector Collins approached from the building's entrance, his radio crackling with updates. "He's home," answered the intercom normally. No sign he suspects anything. Collins looked at Zenaida. "Are you ready for this?" She thought of Giuseppe's blessing before she left Italy, Elena's fierce hug at Florence Airport, Marco's proud smile as he'd shown her the final evidence dossier. Her allies had helped her remember who she truly was, but this moment belonged to her alone. "I'm ready." The building's security door buzzed open, and they climbed 2 flights of stairs in professional silence. Collins knocked on David's door with the authoritative rap of someone who expected immediate compliance. "David Matthews? Metropolitan Police." "Open the door, please." The silence stretched long enough for Zenaida to hear her own heartbeat. Then footsteps, a chain rattling, the click of locks being disengaged. The door opened to reveal David in expensive, casual clothes that Zenaida now realized had been purchased with her stolen money. His face went through a remarkable series of expressions: confusion, recognition, disbelief, and finally something approaching panic. "Mom?" His voice cracked slightly. "What? How are you here? You're supposed to be in Italy." "Hello, David." Zenaida's voice was steady, carrying all the authority she'd once used to discipline unruly students. "Yes, I'm supposed to be in an Italian care facility, spending your stolen money while you liquidate my assets. Fortunately, you severely miscalculated my capabilities." Collins stepped forward with his warrant. "David Matthews, you're under arrest for financial elder abuse, theft, and false imprisonment. You have the right to remain silent." But David wasn't listening to the caution. His eyes were fixed on his mother with growing horror as he realized the extent of his miscalculation. "Mom, I don't understand. You were confused. You needed help managing your finances." "I was grieving and retreating from life," Zenaida corrected sharply. "You mistook emotional withdrawal for cognitive decline, then exploited what you thought was my vulnerability to steal from me systematically." Sarah stepped forward, her expression cold with satisfaction. "Hello, David. Surprised to see me working with your mother? You might want to thank me. I documented 2 years of your suspicious spending around the children. It made building the case much easier." David's face went pale. "Sarah, you don't understand. I was helping Mom, managing her affairs." "By stealing £85,000? Collins interjected, snapping handcuffs onto David's wrists. "By abandoning her in Italy, with €37 and no way home?" "That's not." "I left her money. I arranged for care." David's protests sounded weak even to his own ears. Victoria stepped forward with legal precision. "Mr. Matthews, we have your recorded admission that you were reimbursing yourself from your mother's accounts without her informed consent. We have evidence of your fraudulent lifestyle, your plans to sell her home, and your deliberate abandonment of her in Italy." David looked around the group with growing desperation. "This is insane. Mom, tell them about your memory problems, your confusion." Zenaida stepped closer to her son, her voice carrying decades of disappointed authority. "David, the only confusion was mine. Confusion about how I could have raised a son who would steal from his mother and abandon her when she became inconvenient." "But you can't. You're not capable of." David's voice trailed off as he finally understood the magnitude of his error. "Capable of what? Thinking clearly? Managing my own affairs? Fighting back when betrayed?" Zenaida's smile was sharp as a blade. "You're right that I wasn't capable of those things for a while. Grief and betrayal can do that to a person. But abandoning me in Italy was the best thing you could have done for my recovery." Collins began leading David toward the stairs. "We'll need you to come to the station for formal statements," he told Zenaida. "This will likely go to court." "I'm prepared for that," Zenaida replied, watching as her son was led away in handcuffs. David looked back over his shoulder with an expression of complete bewilderment, as if the laws of physics had suddenly changed around him. Sarah put her arm around Zenaida's shoulders. "How do you feel?" Zenaida considered the question as they watched the police cars drive away with David inside one of them. Sad, she said finally, but not regretful. He made his choices, and now he'll face the consequences. Victoria collected her briefcase. The Crown Prosecution Service will want to review everything before trial, but with this evidence, he'll likely plea bargain. As they left David's building, Zenaida felt the profound satisfaction of justice properly served. Her son had abandoned what he thought was a helpless, confused woman who could never challenge him. Instead, he'd awakened a formidable opponent who'd spent 4 days in Italy remembering exactly who she was and building an unassailable case against him. The woman David had tried to discard was gone forever. In her place stood someone who would never again mistake withdrawal for weakness or allow anyone to confuse her kindness for vulnerability. The reckoning was complete. 3 weeks after David's arrest, Zenaida sat in her own garden for the first time in months, genuinely enjoying the autumn afternoon rather than performing the role of someone who might be enjoying it. The recovered funds had been returned to her accounts, David's fraudulent activities had been fully documented, and the legal proceedings were moving forward with the methodical efficiency that Victoria Hamilton brought to everything she touched. But it was the silence that struck Zenaida most profoundly. No more pretending to be confused when David called. No more carefully crafted performances of declining capability. No more walking on eggshells around her own son's volatile moods and financial desperation. For the first time in 2 years, she could simply be herself. Her phone buzzed with a video call from Italy. Elena's face appeared on the screen, bright with curiosity and concern. "Zenaida, how are you feeling? We've been worried since you texted about the arrest." "I'm processing," Zenaida replied honestly. "It's strange, Elena. I thought I'd feel more triumphant. Instead, I mostly feel sad about the waste of it all." Giuseppe's voice came from off-screen as he joined Elena at the cafe table. "Grief is appropriate, Signora. You didn't just lose the illusion of your son's character, you lost the possibility of who he might have been." The wisdom in that observation hit her unexpectedly hard. She'd been so focused on justice and recovery that she hadn't fully acknowledged the deeper loss. David wasn't just a criminal who'd been caught. He was her child who'd chosen to betray the fundamental trust between them. "There's something else," Zenaida said, shifting topics to safer ground. "I've been contacted by a journalist from The Guardian. They want to write about elder financial abuse, using my case as an example. Victoria thinks it could help other people recognize the warning signs." Elena's expression brightened. "That's wonderful. You could prevent this from happening to other families." Marco appeared in the frame, carrying his laptop. "I've been researching elder abuse statistics in the UK. It's much more common than people realize, especially family members stealing from elderly relatives. Your case could really make a difference." The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, covering everything from legal updates to Elena's new cafe menu to Giuseppe's upcoming homily about the parable of the prodigal son, which he admitted was taking on new complexity in light of recent events. After ending the call, Zenaida found herself walking through her house with fresh eyes. This was her space again, truly hers, without David's anxious hovering or his subtle suggestions about downsizing, simplifying, letting him help with increasingly complex decisions. The doorbell rang, and she opened it to find Sarah standing on the doorstep with Emma and Thomas. The children looked uncertain, clearly having been coached about the delicate nature of this visit. "Hello, Zenaida?" Sarah said carefully. "The children wanted to see you, if that's all right. They have some things they'd like to say." 10-year-old Thomas stepped forward with the serious expression of a child trying to handle adult responsibilities. "Grandma Zenaida, Mom told us about what Dad did. We want you to know we think it was wrong." 8-year-old Emma nodded vigorously. "And we're sorry he used your money to buy us things. We didn't know it was stolen." Zenaida felt her throat tighten. These children were trying to apologize for their father's crimes, carrying guilt that belonged entirely to David. "Come in, both of you," she said, stepping aside. "Emma, Thomas, you have absolutely nothing to apologize for. Your father's choices are not your responsibility." In the sitting room, over tea and biscuits that Zenaida had bought with her own properly managed money, The children asked careful questions about Italy, about Father Giuseppe and Elena, about whether she was really all right now. "Are you still going to be our grandma?" Emma asked with the directness that only children possess. "Even though Dad is in trouble?" "Always." Zenaida replied firmly. "Your father's actions don't change how much I love you both." Sarah watched this exchange with visible relief. "They've been worried about losing you too. This whole situation has been—" She paused, searching for words. "Traumatic for everyone," Zenaida finished. "But Sarah, I want you to know, I don't blame you for any of this. If anything, I'm grateful you were suspicious enough to document David's activities. Without your evidence, he might have gotten away with it." After Sarah and the children left, promising to return the following weekend, Zenaida called Victoria to discuss the journalist interview and the ongoing legal proceedings. "David's solicitor is pushing for a plea bargain," Victoria reported. "He's likely to receive a suspended sentence with restitution and financial monitoring, given that he has no prior convictions and has already returned the stolen funds." "What about supervised visitation with the children?" "That will be up to the family court, but given the circumstances, probably yes." "Eventually." Victoria paused. "Zenaida, I need to ask, how do you feel about the possibility that David might try to contact you directly? To apologize or to justify his actions?" Zenaida considered this carefully. "I think I'm ready for that conversation if it happens. Not to reconcile. That would require trust that no longer exists. But to establish clear boundaries for whatever relationship we might have going forward." That evening, she called Elena again, this time from her garden as the sun set over London. "I've been thinking about what Giuseppe said, about grieving for who David might have been. But there's something else I need to grieve." "What's that?" "The woman I was before Harold's affair, before his death, before I started hiding from life. I can't get her back exactly, but I can learn from her." Zenaida looked at the roses she'd neglected for months, now carefully pruned and beginning to show new growth. "I want to do more than just recover from this, Elena. I want to use it." "Use it how?" "The journalist interview is just the beginning. I want to help other elderly people, recognize financial abuse, stand up to family members who exploit their vulnerabilities, maybe work with organizations that support elder rights." Elena's smile was visible even through the phone screen. The woman who organized her own rescue from Italy would be excellent at helping others fight back. As darkness settled over London, Zenaida remained in her garden, planning a future that looked nothing like the comfortable decline into dependency that David had envisioned for her. Instead of becoming smaller and more manageable, she was expanding into advocacy, into new purposes, into the fullest expression of who she'd always been capable of being. David's betrayal had been intended to eliminate her autonomy and agency. Instead, it had awakened both more powerfully than they'd existed in years. The irony wasn't lost on her, and for the first time since his arrest, she found herself genuinely smiling. 6 months after David's arrest, the Old Bailey courtroom felt smaller than Zenaida had expected. She sat in the public gallery beside Victoria, watching as her son stood before the judge in an ill-fitting suit that spoke of reduced circumstances and borrowed dignity. The confident architect who had once patronized her about her declining capabilities had been replaced by a man who looked genuinely broken by the consequences of his choices. Judge Patricia Hensley reviewed the case files with the methodical attention that had made her reputation in financial crime proceedings. When she looked up, her gaze moved between David at the defendant's table and Zenaida in the gallery, assessing both victim and perpetrator with equal scrutiny. "Mr. Matthews," Judge Hensley began, her voice carrying the weight of legal authority, "you have pleaded guilty to charges of financial elder abuse, theft, and false imprisonment. The court has reviewed extensive evidence documenting systematic theft of £85, 247 from your mother's accounts over a period of 24 months, culminating in your abandonment of her in a foreign country with insufficient resources to return home." David kept his eyes fixed on the floor as the judge continued. "What makes this case particularly egregious is the calculated nature of your deception. You exploited what you believed to be your mother's cognitive decline, manipulated her grief and withdrawal following her husband's death, and systematically isolated her from information that would have revealed your criminal activities." Victoria squeezed Zenaida's hand gently as Judge Hensley outlined the full scope of David's betrayal in precise legal language. It was one thing to know the facts intellectually. It was another to hear them recited as criminal acts in a court of law. However, the judge continued, the court also notes that you have cooperated fully with investigators, made complete restitution to your mother, and shown what appears to be genuine remorse for your actions. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison's psychological evaluation suggests that your behavior stemmed from financial desperation and poor decision-making rather than malicious intent to permanently harm your mother. Zenaida watched David's shoulders shake slightly. The psychological evaluation had been thorough and, ultimately, more sympathetic than she'd expected. The bankruptcy of his architectural firm, the divorce, the mounting debts, the depression he'd hidden from everyone, none of it excused his choices, but it provided context that complicated her feelings about justice and forgiveness. Mrs. Zenaida Matthews, Judge Hensley said, looking directly at her, would you like to make a victim impact statement before sentencing? Zenaida stood carefully, feeling the weight of the moment. She'd prepared remarks. But now, looking at David's hunched shoulders, and remembering the confident man who'd kissed her forehead before abandoning her in Italy, the prepared words seemed inadequate. Your Honor, 6 months ago I was a woman pretending to be confused, because it seemed easier than facing difficult truths about my life and my family. My son exploited that performance, but in doing so he also ended it. She paused, choosing her words carefully. David's betrayal was devastating, but it also forced me to rediscover capabilities I'd forgotten I possessed. I found allies I never would have met, strength I thought I'd lost, and a purpose I didn't know I needed. She looked directly at David for the first time since entering the courtroom. He had raised his head and was staring at her with an expression of profound regret and something that might have been admiration. I don't want revenge, Your Honor. I want accountability. I want my son to understand that his actions had consequences not just for me, but for his children, his ex-wife, and everyone who trusted him. Most importantly, I want other families to recognize the warning signs of financial elder abuse before it reaches the point where criminal charges become necessary. Judge Hensley nodded approvingly. Thank you, Mrs. Matthews. Your dignity throughout this process has been noted by the court. The sentencing was swift and fair. 18 months suspended sentence, 3 years of financial monitoring, 200 hours of community service working with elder care organizations, and mandatory counseling. David would avoid prison if he complied with all conditions, but any further financial impropriety would result in immediate incarceration. As the court adjourned, David's solicitor guided him toward the exit, but he stopped near where Zenaida was gathering her things. Mum, he said quietly, his voice hoarse with emotion, could we talk? Not today, but when you're ready. Zenaida studied her son's face, seeing genuine remorse alongside the familiar self-pity that had characterized his behavior for years. David, I'm willing to have that conversation eventually, but it will be on my terms, with clear boundaries about what kind of relationship we can have going forward. I understand. He paused, struggling with words. I'm sorry isn't enough, but I am. I'm so sorry for all of it. Sorry is a beginning, Zenaida replied, but trust requires actions, not just words. Outside the courthouse, Victoria and Zenaida were met by a small group of reporters interested in the case's implications for elder financial abuse awareness. The Guardian article had generated significant attention, and Zenaida had become something of an advocate for elderly victims' rights. Mrs. Matthews called Rebecca Chen from the BBC. What would you tell other elderly people who might be experiencing financial abuse from family members? Trust your instincts, Zenaida replied firmly. If something feels wrong with your finances, with how family members are treating you, with pressure to make decisions quickly, trust that feeling. Don't let anyone convince you that age or grief has made you incapable of thinking clearly. And remember that asking for help from outside your family isn't betrayal. It's self-preservation. That evening, Zenaida sat in her garden with her laptop, participating in a video call with Giuseppe, Elena, and Marco in Italy. The evening light in London was softer than the golden Tuscan sunshine streaming through the cafe windows on her screen, but the warmth of connection was equally strong. How was court? Elena asked immediately. Fair, Zenaida replied thoughtfully. Justice was served, but it wasn't the triumphant moment I'd expected. Mostly it was sad. Seeing David so diminished, understanding how his choices hurt everyone around him, including himself. Giuseppe nodded with the wisdom of someone who'd counseled many families through difficult moments. Justice and mercy are not always comfortable companions, but they are both necessary. There's something else, Zenaida continued. The judge mentioned my advocacy work in her remarks. I've been invited to speak at a conference on elder rights next month, and Age UK wants me to help develop educational materials for identifying financial abuse. Marco's face lit up with pride. You're going to help so many people, Signora Zenaida. I hope so, but I also wanted to ask. She paused, suddenly feeling uncertain. Would it be terribly presumptuous of me to visit San Michele again next month? I know I've already imposed on your kindness enormously. Elena laughed, the sound bright and warm through the computer speakers. Imposed? Zenaida, you're family now. My guest room is always ready for you. And I would be honored to show you more of Tuscany, Giuseppe added. Perhaps some places where the history is less traumatic than where we first met. As the call ended with promises of upcoming reunion and continued friendship, Zenaida realized that David's betrayal had given her something she'd never expected. A chosen family that spanned countries and cultures, bound together by shared values rather than accidents of birth. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Kids want to know if you're free for Sunday lunch next week. Thomas is learning to cook and wants to make you his specialty. Pasta with too much cheese, apparently. Zenaida typed back her acceptance, then called Emma and Thomas directly to hear about Thomas's culinary ambitions and Emma's latest school project about Italy. Inspired, Sarah had told her, by stories about their grandmother's adventures in Tuscany. Later that night, as she prepared for bed in her own house, secure now in the knowledge that her finances and future were truly her own, Zenaida reflected on the strange journey that had brought her from abandoned victim to empowered advocate. David's plan had been to make her disappear quietly into dependency and institutional care while he liquidated her assets. Instead, he'd awakened a strength she'd forgotten she possessed, and connected her with people who'd helped her remember who she truly was. Tomorrow, she would continue working on her speech for the Elder Rights Conference, reviewing the statistics that Marco had helped her compile, and the personal stories that other victims had shared with her. She would also respond to emails from journalists, social workers, and family members seeking advice about suspected financial abuse. But tonight, she simply sat in her garden one more time, grateful for allies who'd become friends, for justice fairly served, and for the profound satisfaction of discovering that even the deepest betrayals could become sources of unexpected strength. David had tried to write her out of her own story. Instead, he'd helped her begin the most important chapter of her life. The irony was perfect, and for the first time since this all began, Zenaida found herself genuinely grateful for every difficult step of the journey that had brought her home to herself. 1 year and 3 months after David had abandoned her at the Villa Bertoli, Zenaida stood once again on the terrace of the same Tuscan villa, but this time as a guest who had chosen to be there. The morning sun painted the same golden light across the terracotta tiles, but everything else had fundamentally changed, including the woman who now occupied the space with complete ownership of her presence and purpose. Signora Bertoli emerged from the villa carrying a tray of fresh coffee and warm cornetti, her weathered face bright with genuine pleasure. Over the past year, she and Zenaida had developed an unlikely friendship through Elena's translations and Marco's patient assistance with international phone calls. Buongiorno, Signora Zenaida, Signora Bertoli said, her English carefully practiced. You sleep well? Perfectly, thank you, Maria. Zenaida had finally learned the villa owner's first name during her 3rd visit to San Michele. The view is even more beautiful than I remembered. It was true. The rolling hills of Tuscany stretched endlessly toward the horizon, dotted with cypress trees and medieval villages that seemed unchanged by centuries. But Zenaida's perception had been transformed by her journey from victim to survivor, to advocate. Where she had once seen only her abandonment and fear, she now saw the landscape where she'd rediscovered her strength. Elena's voice carried across the garden as she approached with Giuseppe and Marco, all of them laden with supplies for the day's celebration. Today marked the official opening of the Zenaida Matthews Center for Elder Advocacy, a modest but meaningful foundation that Elena and Giuseppe had helped her establish to support elderly people facing financial abuse and family exploitation. "Ready for your big day?" Elena asked, embracing Zenaida warmly. Over the past year, their friendship had deepened into something that resembled sisterhood. Two women who'd found each other through crisis and chosen to build something lasting from the connection. "As ready as anyone can be for seeing their name on a building," Zenaida replied with a smile. "Though I still think we should have named it after San Michele instead." Giuseppe laughed as he set down boxes of materials for the afternoon ceremony. "The village already has a patron saint, Zenaida. But it didn't have a patron advocate for elderly rights until you came along." The center itself was modest. 3 rooms above Elena's cafe, equipped with computers, legal resources, and secure communication systems that Marco had designed. But it represented something profound. A place where elderly people could receive support, information, and advocacy when facing exploitation or abuse from any source, including family members. Over the past year, Zenaida had split her time between London and San Michele, building the foundation while continuing her advocacy work in England. She testified before parliamentary committees about elder financial abuse, consulted on legislation, and spoken at conferences across Europe. The shy, withdrawn woman who had pretended to be confused was now a recognized expert whose opinions were sought by policymakers and social services organizations. But it was the individual cases that gave her work its deepest meaning. In the past 6 months alone, the center had helped 12 elderly people document and escape financial exploitation, connected families with legal resources, and provided safe communication channels for those whose access to outside support had been compromised by controlling relatives. "Zenaida," Marco called from the villa's entrance, holding up his tablet. "Your video call with London is ready. Sarah and the children are waiting." The screen showed Sarah's kitchen, where 10-year-old Thomas was proudly displaying a banner he'd made reading, "Congratulations, Nona Zenaida," while 8-year-old Emma bounced excitedly beside him. "Nana, are you really opening your own office today?" Emma asked, her face pressed close to the camera. "A very small office, tesoro," Zenaida replied, her heart warming at the Italian endearment the children had learned during their visit to San Michele the previous summer. "But yes, today we officially open the center." Thomas, now 11 and increasingly serious about injustice in all its forms, leaned into the frame. "Mum says you're helping other grandparents who had problems like you did with Dad." The mention of David no longer carried the sharp sting it once had, though the complexity of their relationship remained unresolved. He had completed his community service requirements, was consistently attending counseling, and had maintained steady employment at a small architectural firm specializing in social housing projects, work that seemed to have given him perspective on his previous lifestyle choices. They had met twice since the sentencing. Carefully structured conversations in neutral locations with clear boundaries. David's remorse appeared genuine, but trust would require years to rebuild, if it could be rebuilt at all. For now they maintained cordial but limited contact, primarily coordinated through Sarah for the children's benefit. "That's exactly right, Thomas," Zenaida confirmed. "Sometimes people need help standing up for themselves, and sometimes families need help understanding when they're not treating elderly relatives properly." After ending the call with promises to bring the children back to Italy for Easter, Zenaida found herself walking the same path down to San Michele that she'd taken on that first desperate afternoon 13 months ago. But now she walked with Elena and Giuseppe as friends and equals, discussing the afternoon's ceremony and the foundation's future plans. The village had embraced both the center and Zenaida herself with warmth that still surprised her. The morning market vendors saved her the best produce. The children waved when they saw her in the piazza, and the elderly residents had adopted her as one of their own, a recognition that felt more valuable than any professional accolade. "There's something I need to tell you both," Zenaida said as they reached the church of San Michele, where her journey had truly begun. "I've been offered a position with the European Union's Committee on Aging and Elder Rights, based in Brussels, consulting on policy development across member countries." Elena stopped walking, her expression shifting between pride and concern. "That's incredible, Zenaida. you'd be helping people across the entire continent. But? Zenaida prompted, recognizing her friend's hesitation. But Brussels is not San Michel, Giuseppe said quietly. And policy work, however important, is different from direct advocacy with individuals. It was a concern Zenaida had wrestled with for weeks since receiving the offer. The EU position would give her influence on legislation that could protect millions of elderly Europeans from exploitation. But it would also mean leaving the hands-on work with individual victims, the personal connections that made each case meaningful. I haven't decided yet, she admitted. Part of me thinks I could have more impact on a larger scale. But another part of me knows that policy without personal understanding becomes academic exercise. They walked in comfortable silence through the village streets, passing the cafe where she'd first met Elena, the church where Giuseppe had offered sanctuary, the small piazza where children still played football between the fountain stones. San Michel had become more than a refuge. It had become a place where she'd learned to be fully herself again. The afternoon ceremony was intimate but meaningful. Victoria Hamilton had flown in from London, bringing greetings from several UK organizations that had collaborated with the centre. A representative from the Italian Ministry of Social Services spoke about the importance of grassroots advocacy. Local officials, village residents, and a handful of clients who'd been helped by the centre gathered in Elena's cafe for the formal ribbon cutting. But it was Giuseppe's blessing that moved Zenaida most deeply. Standing in his simple black cassock before the modest plaque reading, Centro di Difesa per Anziani Zenaida Matthews, he spoke about sanctuaries, how they could be physical places like churches or psychological states like the courage to seek help. A year ago, our friend Zenaida sought sanctuary in our village when she had been abandoned and betrayed. Today, she has created sanctuary for others who face similar trials. This is how healing becomes service, and service becomes healing. As the afternoon celebration continued, Zenaida found herself drawn back to the villa terrace as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. The same view that had once represented her lowest moment now embodied transformation and possibility. Her phone buzzed with a message from an unexpected source. David. Mom, I saw the BBC article about the centre opening. I'm proud of what you've built from what I put you through. I hope someday you'll let me contribute to the work, even in a small way. Congratulations. Love, David. The message was carefully worded, acknowledging responsibility without requesting immediate forgiveness or relationship restoration. It suggested genuine growth, though Zenaida remained cautious about interpreting his motivations. She was composing a measured reply when Elena joined her on the terrace carrying 2 glasses of Chianti Classico. Penny for your thoughts? Elena asked, settling into the chair beside her. David sent congratulations about the centre. He says he'd like to contribute to the work somehow. Elena sipped her wine thoughtfully. How does that make you feel? Complicated? Zenaida replied honestly. Part of me wants to believe he's genuinely changed. Another part remembers that he's an expert at saying what he thinks people want to hear. Time will tell, Elena observed. But you don't have to decide anything today. Today is about celebrating what you've accomplished. As if summoned by their conversation, Giuseppe and Marco appeared on the terrace, Marco carrying his laptop and Giuseppe bearing a bottle of the village's finest wine. We have a surprise, Marco announced, opening the laptop to reveal a professionally designed website. The center's new online presence, with resources in 6 languages and secure reporting systems for potential victims. The website was beautiful and functional, with testimonials from clients, educational materials about recognizing financial abuse, and step-by-step guides for seeking help. Most importantly, it connected visitors to a network of advocates and legal resources across Europe. Marco, Zenaida said, genuinely moved. This is incredible. But how did you afford professional web development? I didn't pay for it, Marco grinned. I built it myself. Turns out that helping you develop the center's tech infrastructure has given me new skills. I'm starting a consulting business focused on digital solutions for non-profits. Giuseppe raised his wineglass. It seems that everyone who touches this work finds their own transformation. As they toasted the day's success and the future's possibilities, Zenaida realized that her decision about the EU position was becoming clear. Policy work was important, but this network of personal connections, individual transformations, and community-based solutions, this was where her heart belonged. "I've decided about Brussels," she said quietly. "I'm going to decline the position." Elena looked surprised. "Are you sure? It's an incredible opportunity." "It is. But opportunities come in many forms." Zenaida gestured toward the village below, where lights were beginning to twinkle in windows as families gathered for dinner. "I found my purpose here, with all of you. The center is just the beginning. There's so much more we can build together." Giuseppe nodded with satisfaction. Sometimes the greatest influence comes not from the highest position, but from the deepest roots. As evening settled over Tuscany, the four friends, priest, cafe owner, programmer, and advocate, sat on the terrace where Zenaida's journey had begun, planning new initiatives and sharing stories of the people they'd helped. The foundation was small but growing, with inquiries from other European cities about replicating their model. Zenaida's phone buzzed with another message, this time from an elderly woman in Manchester whose daughter had been controlling her finances. The woman had found their website and was asking for help understanding her rights. It was the kind of message Zenaida received several times a week now, requests for help that she was uniquely qualified to provide because of her own experience. She typed a careful response, offering immediate support and connecting the woman with local resources, then added the case to her follow-up list. Tomorrow she would begin working with another family, navigating the complex territory between care and control, love and exploitation. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if David hadn't abandoned you here?" Elena asked as they watched stars appear in the darkening sky. Zenaida considered the question seriously. "I think I would have continued retreating from life until there was nothing left of who I really am." His betrayal was devastating, but it also forced me to remember that I'm stronger than I'd allowed myself to believe. And now? Now I know that the worst thing someone can do to you can sometimes become the catalyst for the best thing you do with your life. She smiled at her friends. Chosen family forged through crisis and commitment. David tried to make me disappear. Instead, he helped me become more visible than I'd ever been. Later that evening, as Maria Bertoli bid them good night and returned to the villa, the four friends remained on the terrace, unwilling to end a perfect day. Giuseppe produced a bottle of grappa, Marco shared stories about his expanding tech consulting business, and Elena described her plans for a second cafe location that would include meeting space for advocacy groups. "There's something else," Zenaida said as the grappa warmed her throat and loosened her natural reserve. "I've been asked to write a book about elder advocacy. Not just my story, but a practical guide for recognizing and escaping financial abuse." "You should do it," Elena said immediately. "Your story could help thousands of people." "The publisher wants to call it The Woman Who Fought Back," Zenaida continued. "But I was thinking about something different. The art of being underestimated. About how to turn other people's assumptions into your own advantage." Marco laughed appreciatively. "Perfect. That's exactly what you did to David." Giuseppe raised his glass one final time. "To the art of being underestimated, and to friends who help us remember who we truly are." As they drank the final toast of the evening, Zenaida felt the deep satisfaction of a life reclaimed and repurposed. The abandoned, confused woman who had sat on this same terrace 13 months ago was gone forever, replaced by someone who had transformed betrayal into advocacy, isolation into connection, and victimhood into empowerment. David's plan to dispose of his problematic mother had backfired spectacularly. Instead of disappearing quietly into institutional care, she had become a voice for thousands of elderly people facing similar exploitation. Instead of losing her independence, she had discovered capabilities she'd never known she possessed. Instead of ending her story, his abandonment had begun the most meaningful chapter of her life. The Villa Terrace, once the scene of her deepest despair, had become the launching point for a mission that spanned continents. The view remained the same, but everything else had been transformed by the journey from victim to advocate, from isolation to community, From fear to fierce determination. As her friends finally departed for their respective homes and Zenaida prepared for bed in Maria's comfortable guest room, she felt profoundly grateful for every difficult step that had brought her to this moment. Tomorrow she would continue her work, helping other elderly people remember their own strength and rights. Next week, she would return to London to testify at another parliamentary hearing. Next month, she would speak at a conference in Rome about international cooperation on elder abuse prevention. But tonight, she simply sat by her window looking out over the village where she'd learned to fight back, surrounded by the peace that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you're meant to do with your life. David had tried to write her out of her own story. Instead, he'd helped her write the most important chapter she'd ever lived. The irony was perfect, the justice complete, and the future bright with possibility. In San Michele, church bells chimed midnight, marking the end of one day and the beginning of another. Zenaida smiled as she prepared for sleep, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new people to help, and new opportunities to turn the art of being underestimated into the power to change lives. The transformation was complete. The mission had just begun. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Quote,